As a painter, I know that when I'm painting a still life, it may, on the surface, look like a bowl of pears, but really, it's shapes and colors. It's a composition. I think an important part of my development has been the many trips abroad that probably have influenced me in numerous ways that I'm not even aware of. My husband and I have been taking students to Europe for nearly 2 decades now. It became almost a yearly pilgrimage for a while. Of late, it's been taking students to the south of France to paint landscapes, but always accompanied by museum visits in Paris. While we were in the south of France 2 years ago, there was a particularly memorable exhibit at the Foundation Mag. It was an exhibition of the work of 2 painters, Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon. Although both of these men are working with the figure, I admired Bacon for his ability to use empty space and interesting arbitrary color. I also appreciate Freud for his penetrating and very British sense of observation. I have found that there's much more to being a painter than just the time spent at the easel in the studio. The truth of the matter is that there are many tangential jobs that need doing in order to make things happen. One is framing one's work, and the other is photographing it. Fortunately, I have a friend, Stephen Duran, who's also a painter. Often I have taken my work to Stephen, and he's been kind enough to help me with this really all-important task of documenting the work. I've finally gotten it down to where I make my slides from the transparencies taken. Once the slides are made into 35 millimeters, they often still have to be masked and labeled. Last year we lived 5 months in England. An event that at the foundation was an exchange, a teaching exchange that my husband did with Kingston University. We ended up using Jeff Dello's studio. Jeff Dello being a painter from London. Very early on, upon arrival in mid-September, I believe, was going to be the studio launch at Creekside. Creekside is a warehouse occupied by 40-some artists on the east side of London, very near Greenwich. These artists have banded together to form an art center and provide themselves with studio space in which to work. We were lucky enough to have one of the studios that actually opened up onto the creek. When we arrived in London, we had to hit the ground running, as it were, because there was an exhibition of Creekside artists less than a month away. I took a collapsible Black & Decker workbench that I found there, and combined that with some gypsum wallboard that I pulled up from the sculptor's yard. It happened to be kind of warped, and laid that across his collapsed workbench to kind of create that vignette that I'm used to having, or that stage settings. I brought with me a few things from my studio, particularly some Indian pastry pins, looking down on my subject, which I don't do as much of. So I think that led to an interesting change of perspective. About mid-September, with very fortunate weather conditions, the artists held this large launch and gala opening with the public invited for the entire weekend. There were a couple of receptions, and essentially the artists held their studios open from noon till 7 all through the weekend, with, I believe, about 2,000 people filing through. They had some rather formal speech making with members of Parliament present, and it was all quite a success. Also quite fatiguing to stand and greet people for an entire weekend, but it was very interesting and a very lucky break for us to have the opportunity to meet so many people, have so many people see our work. I feel quite fortunate to have been included in that. It turned out to be a lovely, sunny September weekend. There was a pub and cafe and food set up in the yard where the sculptors often work, and it turned into quite a family weekend for Londoners. At the beginning stages of a painting, a lot of time is spent selecting and arranging, creating the stage setting, deciding the format, and trying to find relationships between the objects on probably many different levels. On the surface, I feel like I'm creating a sculptural relationship between shapes and colors. And then the next procedure is usually to lay out a palette, which can take at least an hour. And in that process of laying out the palette, which is a rather limited palette that I use, so it's a lot of cross-mixing of paint, I begin to assemble some plan what the color scheme might be. I like to keep painting wet into wet and make it look as though it was painted all at once, as opposed to painting it all at once. Something that is important to me in my painting is that it have a certain kind of seamless quality in the paint film. Sometimes I will paint all night if that's what it takes to make the wet paint be woven into wet paint and get the effect I want. I believe that teaching has been an important way to learn. My experiences when teaching at Kendall, at Grand Valley, and at present at Aquinas College have been valuable as they've required me to verbalize and bring to a conscious level the things that I do intuitively when I paint. I think that also it's very stimulating and a healthy balance to the solitude of the studio. When people look at my paintings, my hope is that there are enough levels at which a viewer can find something that meets their interest. I have a stage in my studio on which I set my pedestal, whatever it might be. It's frequently been an ironing board. It could be the blue trunk, or it even could be a shelf in a corner. And my method, after establishing what the pedestal will be, is, I think, almost more theatrical. And I think of it at that stage as being somewhat a found object sculpture. From almost the point where I realized that my subject had turned into still life, I began to haunt antique malls and bric-a-brac shops, and so over time I've accumulated quite a number of objects from which to draw upon. I guess for me it's important that there be several levels to the paintings, and that at the same time that the painting for me as I paint it is an abstraction, that it also have this level of relating to the real world, representing recognizable objects that have their own connotation as an object. I wouldn't want to imply that all of the paintings have an overt meaning to me. On some other level, I'm never sure what is coming into play. I know that I do sometimes play little games of implied animism that the objects might have, implied vignettes or narratives. There is, I think, an even equally or simultaneously important element in meaningful work. It's knowing that you have to keep pursuing something and not be satisfied when you start to recognize it creeping up. It sometimes happens in the most fruitful way when one has followed the discipline long enough and reaches that point where the work suddenly takes over and it's something else painting the painting now. And you are there, but you're not there. It's a spiritual experience almost. Cézanne used to speak of, oh, to be that moment when you've put all this effort into it, and now you go into another space, and it sounds very spooky to describe it, and yet I know from talking to writers, poets, and other disciplines often experience this same phenomena. It's like you become a conduit, and it's some universal soul now is operating, and when you're finished, you are amazed at what has come out. I think that comes from pushing far enough, pushing long enough, not being satisfied, knowing that the vision is yet ahead.